I'd like to welcome to the stage the next panel, which will be on norms for international peace and security in cyberspace. As the panelists come out, and Jim Lewis will be moderating this panel, I did want to take one moment to mention that on the topic of norms specifically, this past, or 2 weeks ago, we lost one of our closest colleagues and friends who spent the last number of years working on the development of norms in the cyberspace realm, and that was Roger Hurwitz. I know many of you here today know him, and many of you probably worked with him. So I just wanted to say, call out to him and say thanks for all your work, and we will deeply miss him. In fact, in part of his last active service and work, he was actually at the World Summit at The Hague when he passed away the other week. So if any of you are interested in any of his work, he is a brilliant scholar, published author, a research scientist at MIT, and I know Jim and others were very close to him. So today as well, it's a great day to talk about cybersecurity. It's a day to think of Roger, and we will miss him. Over to you, Jim.
Thanks, Catherine, and good morning to everyone. Thank you for coming out. We have a stellar panel, as you can tell. Chris Painter to my left, followed by Ambassador Norbert Riedel, who's the Commissioner for International Cyber Policy in Germany, and is in some ways advantaged in this discussion because of his extensive China experience, which I think is always a good thing to know in cybersecurity. And finally, Francois Rivesso, who's the Deputy Head of the EU delegation here in the US, and who has done a fair amount of work on norms, came to several of our norms events at CSIS when we had a big project sponsored by the EU. So all of them are experts. The format today is that each will speak for about 10 minutes. I will look exceptionally pained at about the 9-minute mark, so hopefully they will take that. We had a fourth panelist who unfortunately couldn't make it, but this is a great show. What we'll do is 10 minutes of presentation from each. I'll start with a few questions, and then we'll see if we get anything from the floor, so don't be bashful. We're just going to go down the row. That means, Francois, you will close up. Chris, you will start.
All right. Good. Well, thank you, and it's good to be here. Two things I just want to say at the outset. First, I want to echo what Catherine said about Roger Hurwitz. We will truly miss him. I saw him at The Hague, and he very proudly gave me a copy of the pamphlet from the process that he started at MIT to bring people together to discuss norms. And so he was a real important voice in this issues, and it's really sad to see him leave us. So it's unfortunate, but hopefully our work obviously will continue, and I think he really gave a good kickstart to that. The other thing I wanted to say, and it's too bad that our colleague from the Netherlands isn't here, is I just was at the conference in the Netherlands, the Dutch conference, and that I think really was a good meeting, bringing together all different stakeholders, including many foreign ministers who often don't play in this space, and I think it's important to have them involved, especially when we're talking about issues of norms, but also civil society and others. And I thought that was a very useful conference, both in terms of discussions like the one on the issue we're discussing today, but also in terms of the launch of this capacity building initiative, which I think helps all of us. So with that, let me move into the topic today, which is promoting the U.S. approach for promoting international peace and security in cyberspace, and our goal, as you heard from Michael, of creating a framework for strategic cyber stability. And we recognize that this is not a technology that could easily be controlled, so instead we must forge a consensus and promote active international collaboration on what we see as a series of mutually reinforcing cooperative strategies that together address the transnational nature of the various threats to networked information systems. We've had two real pillars of our approach to this. Principles of responsible state behavior and practical confidence building measures. And there's been a lot of work, especially over the last few years, on both of those. The first pillar in developing principles of responsible state behavior is to, and the first part of this is really to affirm the applicability of international law in cyberspace. And the second pillar is to construct practical measures that build confidence and transparency in cyberspace, that allow states to cooperate, but also allow make sure that there's not inadvertent misperceptions, miscalculation, and escalation. And you can see this in terms of a pyramid where you have transparency measures at their base, cooperative measures, and ultimately stability measures. And we made great progress in both of those areas. So the two things, and Jim is well aware of this, back in 2013, the group of government experts in the UN, I think very significantly affirmed that international law, the UN Charter, applies in cyberspace just like it does in the physical world. How that actually applies, we're still working out, and that's one of the topics of the GGE right now. But that was a pretty seminal thing to say that you don't have a whole set of new rules for cyberspace that you draw from the physical world. And they also endorse the idea of CBMs, and the idea that states shouldn't do things through proxies that they can't do under international law themselves. So all that was really important. And we found that disruptive activities using cyber means cross borders and pose national security threats that have the potential to inflict significant damage. So we need a shared understanding of what acceptable behavior is in cyberspace, what essentially the rules of the road are, otherwise disruption becomes the norm, and that's something we want to avoid. We want to avoid and avoid the much talked about cyber conflict. So taking the GGE and moving it forward, we want all states to really affirm that international law applies. The recent NATO communique that came out of the last NATO summit had that group saying that applies in cyberspace. The recent G7 statement also did that. So I think there's been significant movement there. We've also worked very closely with regional organizations, especially to promote confidence building measures around the world. In the OAS, we've done a lot of work on issues like transnational cybercrime and cybersecurity, but also talked about this issue of confidence building measures. In the OSCE, we reached a landmark agreement for the first 11 confidence building measures, multilateral confidence building measures, which I don't know why we couldn't come up with 10, but it's like the Spinal Tap movie. It went to 11. We had to have 11. So we had 11, and I think those are a good foundational basis that are now being implemented. And we've also proposed CBMs in ASEAN and other regional forums. So I think we're going to continue that going forward. Now, when we talk about the other aspect, the norms aspect, you often hear people say we need a treaty in cyberspace, which I've said often, I don't know what a treaty is in cyberspace. I don't know who signs that treaty. I don't know who parties to that treaty are. And given the fast nature of the technology and the changing nature of the technology, and the fact that we're really in the beginning of the road to think about what appropriate norms in cyberspace are, that's really not something that makes a lot of sense. Even though it's a siren song to have something like that, people will say, well, let's have a treaty. And I don't think that really works. But I think there's an alternative method that we need to build a consensus around measures of self-restraint that states can implement, and both self-restraint and commitments to cooperate. So I talked about the very high level of norms, international law applying, law of armed conflict. So that's the big cyber incident. As one of my colleagues used to say, the flaming ball of cyber death is coming toward you, and so you have to do something about it. But how about all the things we see that are below that very high threshold? We, the United States, and many others too, have begun advancing some what we call peacetime norms, so below that high threshold of conflict, that we think will make us all more stable. And the three that I want to articulate a little bit today is that, one, a state should not conduct or knowingly support online activity that intentionally damages critical infrastructure or otherwise impairs the use of critical infrastructure to provide services to the public. So this, this would be, I think, if states adopted this, if states rallied around this, this would be inherently, create a more inherently stable environment. I can also say that all three of these things I'm going to discuss are ones we believe have universal applicability. They're not just applicable or attractive to the US or our allies. I think they're attractive to every country around the world. The second one is that states should not conduct or knowingly support activity intended to prevent national CSIRTs from responding to cyber incidents, so computer security incident response teams. And the states should also use a CSIRT for their intended purpose, for defensive purposes and not other purposes, purposes that might do harm. And then the third is that a state should cooperate in a manner consistent with its domestic and international obligations with requests for assistance from other states in investigating cybercrimes, collecting electronic evidence, and mitigating malicious activity emanating from its territory. And states must take robust and cooperative action to investigate criminal activity by non-state actors. So you have two measures of restraint, one measure of helping to make sure that you're mitigating activity, and all those together, again, I think universally attractive, would lead to a more stable cyberspace. Now, no single set of measures can cover everything, and the same with having a treaty. You can't have one ring to rule them all, but I think these would certainly make things much more stable in our view. The way I think we reach this, you know, I think as we're still in the beginning of this road, the way we reach this and the model that I've talked about before and talked about in The Hague, as an analogy, not as a strict model, but as an analogy, is the Proliferation Security Initiative, where you get more and more governments to agree that these are measures that they will live by. Just like in the Proliferation Security Initiative, governments were concerned about the spread of fissile materials, so they banded together. They agreed to take some actions of restraint and some actions of cooperation. And ultimately, if there were people outside that group who acted contrary to those general norms, that those countries could act together. Now, this is a long-term process. It's not something that would happen overnight. We have to socialize these norms more. We have to talk about them. But you know, norms on their own are great. Confidence-building measures on their own are great. But there are always going to be actors who violate those norms and decide that to act unilaterally. We've seen this in the physical world. So you need some mechanism to enforce them, and that's what I think is a long-term goal here. So I think this is an important space. It's very important as part of our overall strategy to try to make sure we have a more stable cyber environment. I do think this is something where countries, even if they disagree on other things, can come together. And I think it's an important conversation happening not just in the GGE, but happening in various forums around the world. And so with that, I'll stop.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Norbert, please.
Thank you, Jim. Good morning, everybody. I would like to share with you some views and thoughts from the German perspective. I think the situation is quite clear. Cyberspace is a new theater of distrust and conflict. Numerous states are pursuing military cyber capabilities, but also hackers and terrorists can use or obtain malware. And we just have had the experience with an attack on TV5, TV channel in France, and this was, for us in Europe, I think, a very important issue. Consequently, the opportunity arises for non-state actors to affect targets that had previously been out of reach. Uncertainty about the origin of hostile cyber action is a characteristic of cyber incidents. As a consequence, the masters of cyber capabilities favor the offense. This introduces an element of dangerous instability into international affairs. Cyber incidents can escalate into real-life conflict or even war. So, from the German perspective, what can we do? What should we do? Germany is pursuing a three-pronged approach to confront these challenges. First, we are undertaking efforts to increase cyber resilience. This is what we can do on our own. We can make a commitment to protect our IT systems, to make them more resilient. And you know, we have a digital agenda in our federal government, and the IT Security Act, which is under this discussion at the moment, is a key project. It goes beyond the minimum requirements for IT security of critical infrastructures and the obligation to report significant incidents. The IT Security Act starts with a relationship between risk, protection, and responsibility. Anyone who creates risks for others through the use of IT should also be responsible for protecting against these risks. The more serious these risks are, the higher the standards for the necessary protection should be. This includes the requirement to report significant IT security incidents. As a second step, we are engaged in international fora to explore how international law applies to cybersecurity. We cannot allow cyberspace to be a rule or lawless abode. Given the number of potent actors, rapid developments in the underlying technology, as Chris mentioned, and the need better to define how international law applies to state behavior in cyberspace, the need for rules is in no area as apparent as in the internet. We cannot allow cyberspace to be a rule or lawless abode. Fortunately, there is an emergent international consensus on this point. Agreement on rules, principles, and norms will help or would help enhance transparency and predictability to state behavior in cyberspace. To establish a universal understanding of such rules, norms, and principles, we must first of all turn to the United Nations. United Nations General Assembly has confirmed that international law, and in particular the UN Charter, is applicable to cyberspace. Now it is necessary to find a consensus on how international law is applied in the cyber context. The group of governmental experts, the GGE, remains at the moment the prime forum for this debate. Germany has been invited to participate in all four of these groups since their creation. We are already thinking about what comes next. What is, hopefully, we hope that there will be a consensus in the GGE, but what could be the possible next steps? The good thing is the cybersecurity issue is being discussed and developed in international conferences such as this one. And more state practice is slowly but evolving. One of the questions we could talk about is, could there be a group of states, for example, developing a consensus among its members on rules in cyberspace? And some say that the experience, for example, of the Proliferation Security Initiative, the PSI, could be useful in this context. Yeah. There is consensus that state sovereignty and international norms and principles that flow from sovereignty apply to state conduct of cyber activities and to their jurisdiction over IT infrastructure within their territory. The question now is, what measures of self-restraint states should implement to promote international stability in cyberspace? And it is not about what other states or governments should or could do. It is about what our own government, what we should do and could do. Let me propose some rules. States should not allow IT infrastructure located in their territory to be used for actions that violate international law. States should protect critical information infrastructure located on their territory and should have adequate cybersecurity provisions. This is why we are under discussion about the IT Security Act in Germany at the moment. States should respond to inquiries and appeals for help in case of cyber emergency. And states must respect individuals' universal human rights online as well as offline. We think in Germany that we need a balance between freedom and security. That balance needs to be well thought through and made subject of a political discourse, nationally and internationally. And the instruments of security need to be proportional to the costs they impose on our privacy. Since agreed international rules, principles, and norms help enhance transparency and predictability, they are a stabilizing factor in international affairs, which is dearly needed given the element of instability introduced by the emergence of cyber capabilities and the threat of malicious cyber action. And this brings me to the third step. We advocate and support confidence and security building measures. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Chris already mentioned it, has made important progress in this field. In December 2013, participating states agreed a first set of measures to reduce the risks of misperception, escalation, and conflict that may stem from the use of ICT. A second set is under discussion right now, and Germany will have the presidency in the OSCE in 2016, and this will be an important focus for our presidency. So I think international cybersecurity is a common concern. It should be pursued regardless of political differences in the interest of global stability. And I'm convinced that this is a field where transatlantic cooperation offers itself and where it is urgently required. And so I think you realize that we are very close. Thank you.
Thank you, Norbert. Francois.
Thank you, James. Allow me first to thank the University of Georgetown for organizing this fascinating event and associate also to their homage to the great name we have lost in this field. And it's a pleasure for me to be here today and discuss this ascending security issue worldwide. The EU has already taken a number of measures in the past years. We have harmonized, and it was not easy. Just imagine how it could be to harmonize the legislation of the 50 US states in some sensitive domestic issues, but we have been able to harmonize the cybercrime laws in all member states. It's already an important thing. We have created an agency, European Network Information Security Agency, and a European Cybercrime Center, EC3, and we have put all efforts together within a European cybersecurity strategy in February 2013. And we have identified 5 objectives in them, and you will see that they are exactly the same that Mr. Peiter and the Commissioner Riddle have already outlined. So you know there is a commonality of views here, which is very logical. Cyber resilience, reducing cybercrime, developing cyber defense related to CSDP, developing industrial and technological resources for cybersecurity, which could carry out some elements of a famous sovereignty digital agenda, maybe, and establishing an EU international cyberspace policy. And the Commission is working on a directive on network information security, which should be translated into legislation before the end of this year. But we are facing an issue which is changing every day, every minute. And we are in a field, I would say, which is characterized by some elements you all know. It is an asymmetric field, so any dispute, any conflicts, any difficulties in solving cybersecurity issues have to take into account the fact that it is extremely asymmetric, possibly with space, the most asymmetric field of disputes in the world. And second, it's also a space which is increasingly used for destabilizing operation. So far that we are now talking, we were talking in the Munich conference, for example, about hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare will be the theme of a CSDP conference that the EU organized here this week, in 2 days. And hybrid warfare includes a very important, in the Institute of Peace, and it includes a very important component of cyber security question. We have seen that in Syria and Iraq with the way the terrorist groups are using cyber to recruit and to act. We have seen that in Ukraine also. We see that everywhere. So, what's the challenge? We are here to talk about norms, so I will not insist on the fact that there is a purely defense security dimension here, and that, as you may know, the European Union has tasked the EU in November 2014 to work on this issue. We have adopted an EU cyber defense policy framework which identifies priority areas for CSDP cyber defense, clarifying the roles of the different European actors, and it tackles various subjects such as support to the development of national member state cyber defense capabilities, enhancement of the protection of CSDP communication networks used by EU entity, etc., and enhancement of cooperation with relevant international partners such as NATO. As the White House coordinator said, this is also an issue that we cannot tackle alone. So we have developed dialogues on that, particularly with the US, obviously, but also with China, Japan, India, Korea, and later this year with Brazil. And with the US, and particularly with Mr. Chris Painter, if I may say so, we are holding regular, this is the leading dialogue we have, obviously, and we have having strategic consultations on bilateral and multilateral relationship, and the international policy developments related to cyberspace developments ahead of international events, priority relay. We are also thinking how to reconcile that with the freedom of expression and protection of human rights online. And we consult about norms of state behavior in cyberspace, application of international law, confidence building measures. and also building effort to strengthen security capacities in third countries. I will not repeat what Chris said, because on what international law, applying international law in cyberspace, confidence building measures, and protecting civil critical infrastructure, you have already heard a bit, and we are mostly on the same line and at the same level of effort. I will just tell you that we are preparing a paper, a foot-for-foot paper for international security developments in cyberspace, which is designated to strengthen the work of a UN group of experts, because we consider that we are in a process of developing the norms in cyberspace, but we are not starting from scratch. There's not an international vacuum in this domain. As we always recall during our EU bilateral cyber dialogues, existing international law applies in cyberspace. And that's why, by the way, we don't support the creation of any new legal instruments, but we consider that state behavior, for example, should follow the long-established principles of existing international law. States should follow proportionality, distinction, and other principles as set by the international humanitarian law, and also should uphold the legal obligation enshrined in all the law about civil and political rights. The argument of cybersecurity must never become a pretext to limit freedom of expression, access to information, and right to privacy. And we have to make a huge work in that, because the developments in this field are exactly as threatening as the development against cybersecurity. So that's why we value highly the work of a UN group of governmental experts. We think cooperation within existing international frameworks will be the most effective way of addressing these issues. And we think that the many important elements have been already articulated in the 2013 UN group report. And we are looking forward to the next UN group report expected in summer 2015. And 5 member states are engaged for the EU in this current group: UK, France, Germany, Spain, and EE, that started in July 2014. We are going to produce a report also, and that's in this context that we are working on this group paper, foot-for-foot paper. Not exclusively for UN, by the way, but also, as it has been mentioned, for regional organization, because working at regional organization is also very useful, and we work mostly in OSCE together with the US, but we have played an important role in the achievements by OSCE, and we are also working in the ASEAN Regional Forum. Obviously, there are many challenges to address. And let me just try to sum up some of those. First challenge, I would say, is linked to how to apply international law in cyberspace, how to reconcile individuals' human rights and fundamental freedoms in cyberspace. There is a clear contradiction. We cannot escape that. There is a contradiction. Maybe the best way of trying to contain the contradiction and organize it is to develop ethical rules. I think we absolutely need, by states, by company, to work very much on ethics. This is finally when you are in front of a problem which seems theoretically impossible to solve. Norms of behavior, ethical norms are the best way, and that's where and why all the work which is done in the US, in Europe, and in regional and world organizations is so important, because it can allow ethical world to develop. That once you have developed this ethical world, then you can have them in codes of conduct, and then you can have them becoming some form of customary law, which will help us trying to address the problem. But I think if we are not guided by ethics in there, we will not be able to be enough legitimate to get enough consensus around what is needed here. Second challenge has been mentioned already by Commissioner Riddle, is the principle regarding state responsibility for internationally wrongful act. And states, it is obvious, should seek to ensure that their territories are not used by non-state actors for unlawful use of ICTs, but how to do that, that's a second question mark. Third question mark. If we consider that we have to find about norm for cyber warfare, don't hesitate to use the word, because this is the situation. Then we have to recognize that the cyberspace activity that constitutes a threat of or use of force may be considered, when made by a state, as a violation of a UN Charter, if it is of sufficient scale of gravity. In such a case, the right of self-defense, as recognized by the UN Charter, Chapter 7, may be triggered by this attack, and then the question is, if the cyber attack carried by a state may bring about the right of self-defense from the state concerned, and this leads immediately to the application of use in bello, then how are we going to define the general principles of distinction, proportionality, and military necessity? This is the third challenge we have really today. And I understand that the US has engaged in a reflection on that, but member states of the EU and then after them the EU will necessarily also to address that. Finally, two last questions. Confidence building measure. How could we reinforce transparency on our cyberspace activities when we are obliged to keep confidentiality of cyberspace security protection measures? We consider that cooperation within international frameworks is probably the most effective way of addressing them. But what are the most useful forums, and what are the ideas which have the most chances to fly? And then protection of critical infrastructure, last question. We need to build cybersecurity resilient and infrastructure which are much more cybersecurity oriented. We see, and there we have a lot of sensibilization to make with the private sector, because every month the private sector is going out with a wonderful new innovation, you know, new iPad, new iPods, new computer, new connected elements, glasses, whatever. All these are huge loopholes for cybersecurity, and we are not able to measure from start and to include from start any analysis of cybersecurity issues involved. And this is the best challenge, the main challenge we have. Make sure that all innovations are properly assessed in terms of cybersecurity, and making sure that we are building a system both in our countries and also in third countries, where there will be a resilience and cybersecurity issues properly taken into account. Because it's in cyber like in everything. You build a system of protection, but you know the strength of your system of protection is always the strength of the lower elements, of the weaker element. So what we have to do is to reinforce the weakest element. This will be my conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francois. And we will now go to a question and answer period. Let me encourage my colleagues to keep their remarks succinct as they answer the questions. I have many. I was going to ask at the beginning for a moment of silence for Roger, who many of you may know. He was a true scholar in the field. He also had a sense of humor, which is really rare. And of course, scholarship in this field is too often measured by volume, and that made Roger particularly special. So we will all miss him in his work on norms. It's interesting too, because one of the things you often hear, not at conferences like this, is that the international discussion would benefit from a greater involvement of the technical community. My experience is completely the opposite, is that the technical community, when they're put in forum like the UN, are kind of like rabbits in a pack of wolves, you know? And it's fun watching them. They get that look, and then they're hunted down and it's not very nice. So that's where Roger was great at bridging both the technical and the diplomatic, but this is very much a political issue. I was laughing at various points because I spent the morning working on a document that probably relates to the GGE, and I recognized from several of my colleagues' remarks that are national submissions. And maybe we can start there by informing our discussion with the political issues that will shape the debate, I think, over the next year. And I'm going to start with one that's a little bit of self-interested use for me, but it might be a good way in, which is an argument you hear very often, not from Western countries, but from others, is that norms legitimize cyber warfare. that by agreeing to the laws of warfare, by agreeing to embed this in the context of international law, we are actually legitimizing cyber warfare. And of course, it's not just China and Russia who say this. If it was, it would be easy to dismiss. So we'll start by seeing if colleagues can think about not dismissing this and saying, oh, that's nonsense. You know, how is it you respond to this idea that what we're doing with norms doesn't legitimize warfare, but actually makes it less likely?
10 seconds of silence first.
That would be good, yes. You can just say yes or no, yeah.
Well, let me start by saying it is nonsense. I mean, look, I think the idea of, let's take the physical world example. People keep thinking cyberspace is so different that you can't apply it. And a lot of the work we've been doing is showing that the cyberspace is grounded in the physical world in terms of all the different concepts we talked about. So are we saying we shouldn't have a UN charter, we shouldn't have the law of armed conflict, we shouldn't have all these things that have brought us safely into where we are now after a lot of worldwide conflagrations, because that might encourage warfare? That's why I just can't accept that as a base principle. Now, you know, I think if the concern is somehow that if you even talk about cyber conflict, that somehow legitimizes it, the problem with that is we know that many, 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 many countries, an increasing number of countries, are developing cyber capabilities. I think that those are more likely will be used, as you said, as one of our panelists said, in hybrid situations like happened in the Ukraine or happened in Georgia, for instance. But with that out there, you do need some stabilizing forces. So you need to really talk about these issues. You need to talk about what the frameworks are and how to apply the existing framework. And simply saying, no, we can't talk about that because that legitimizes it, I think really doesn't serve the ultimate interest of stability for those countries too, not just for the US and Europe and others, but for those countries too. I think they have a shared interest in having that level of stability. So I do think we have to have conversations with countries, actually get down to what is their actual concern, because simply saying, well, it's going to legitimize warfare is not enough. I mean, really figuring out what they think these principles will lead to and why, and address those, and I think we can. What I worry about is this kind of reflexive argument that I've heard, and frankly, I've used to hear this in confidence-building measures too. Oh, confidence-building measures are just a way for you to find out more about us. Transparency is a one-way street. Again, that's not true. It helps everyone. I think it's more of an education process. It's getting other policymakers involved. I think people are a little worried and scared about cyberspace because they do think it's different. They're not technical. So I do think we have some work to do there.
I'm grateful.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm grateful for your remarks. No, it's not working. Huh?
Yeah, it is now.
Okay, there you go.
Thanks for the help. No, I'm grateful for the remarks. We should not forget that the West is not the rest. I mean, we know that, for example, the group of 77 countries, they have different views, maybe totally different views. It's not only about China or Russia. There are a lot of different interests. And so for me, I think one of the most important things at the moment is trust or mistrust. There's a lot of mistrust. When we are discussing these issues with third countries, I feel a lot of mistrust because we know some of these countries, they don't have already the same level of technology. And they think that they will stay behind and maybe even that they could be used. So there is a lot of mistrust. We are trying to work on this, and that's why we are having more and more formal cyber dialogues with, I'm now starting, or I will have a dialogue with China next month, but we are also trying to have formalized cyber dialogues with Brazil or with India, because we really think these are relevant exchanges of views. It is not so easy. And I just remember the last panel when there was a discussion about information sharing. I talked a lot to people working in CERTs all over the world. And you know, I've always got the answer, when I know the other people in other thirds, we are exchanging information without any problem. And then I ask, and what's happening if the person is leaving his job? Yeah, then there's no exchange. So I think this is also about working on norms and, let's say, institutions or regulations, how to work together and building on trust. And this needs time, but the big difference, I think, is that in cyberspace, we don't have so much time because this is really very fast.
James, you have asked us if our reflections were not legitimizing warfare, cyber warfare. Honestly, I don't think so. Because, look, it's not because we are organizing the repression of piracy that we legitimize piracy. The international law and the UN Charter prohibits offensive warfare. The monopoly of use of strength is within the UN Security Council. Except for defensive activities. We have to make the issues more precise, what is offensive, what is defensive. It's sometimes quite difficult. Sometimes I make the parallel between cyber warfare and biological warfare, where you have to know what are the virus to elaborate the counter-virus. So there is a sort of unavoidable link between preparation to war and protection against war. That we know. But if preparation can be ambiguous, action is not, is never. And I think this is the clear line that we can draw on the ground, on the sand. So I don't think our activities are legitimizing the warfare. They are rather trying to prevent them.
Let me just add one thing to that. Part of when we talk about CBMs, these are practical measures. So whatever the debate is about norms or international law, we can move forward on practical confidence-building measures with every country, and we should do that. Second, when I talked about these peacetime norms we're talking about, that means we're not just talking about norms for conflict, we're talking about norms in peacetime, and that's something that makes the entire ecosystem more stable. And so I think it's important to think of this as a package. We're not just talking about the law of armed conflict or the UN Charter. And then finally, I agree with Norbert. I mean, one of the big things we've done, and we have dialogues with India, with Brazil, with others, is this is a subject that needs more discussion, I think, internationally, and more maturing, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Yeah, and I wonder if the pace we're taking might be ambitious, but we can come back to that, because one of the things I see for countries who are not normally members of the Security Council, or countries who are not involved in, forgive the term, great power politics, this is a very new field for them, and they're searching for models. Many of the models we use come from arms control. The arms controllers actually have the best advantage in these discussions. Some come from proliferation, as you've heard. But there's this effort, particularly in the NAM countries, non-aligned movement nations, to find what is the model we want to use for our discussion, our place in the international discussion of cybersecurity. And what some of them have said is that we should think about this the way we think about outer space. Now, I admit, when I hear that, I usually run screaming from the room, but it does come up quite a bit. And so the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space as a model, the idea that as countries, NAM countries, pursue for space, the idea of exclusive peaceful uses for space and for cyberspace, what's the right model here for us to think about it? What would you say to the NAM people in approaching the idea of exclusive peaceful use and agreement and treaties? Why don't I throw that out to the group? They're all going to dodge that one. Okay.
As a former specialist of arms control, I think it's a bit easy to answer immediately, but to provide short-term answers. Long-term answer is more difficult. Short-term answer is that space and cyber are very different. Yes, the asymmetry, they have in common the highest level of asymmetry. but they have as difference the fact that there's for now no non-state actors or private activities in space, and this makes a huge difference. The ways of tracking hostile space activities are very well known. You cannot launch a rocket to shoot down a satellite without being fully identified. This is impossible. This model has its limits. The second element of difference is that we have a treaty prohibiting the use of weapons in outer space already. We don't have that in cyber, and we would like to have that, but unfortunately it's too late because there are already many weapons in the cyberspace. So we are not like in the outer space in a region where we could expect to be able to maintain some kind of notion that this is a common good for mankind. Cyberspace is also a common good for mankind, but unfortunately it's a common good which has been already militarized, and that's the difference between Antarctica of outer space. Outer space, I made the parallel with Antarctica, Antarctica on the Earth. Cyberspace, unfortunately, all the parallels point out towards something that's more like BW, and we know that medicine, health, is supposed to be purely for benefits of mankind. Such are exactly the same than cyber activities. This is the short-term answer. The long-term answer is yes, we should obviously promote the idea that cyber activities should be only peaceful. And this leads us to the idea of protection and non-proliferation. But it is a long way because at this stage, we have a difficulty for that, which is that basically it's the accessibility of a domain which is making it extremely difficult. Basically, every young man or woman with a computer and basic knowledge can begin to start a team of hacking and conduct hostile or disruptive or destructive activities with, in a number of states, very little chances to be caught, and in some other states, maybe even some goodwill from the states to let that happen. This has obliged states to develop a number of measures and countermeasures. And therefore, I would answer the NAM, yes, you are entirely right to say that this should be your basic assumption that this should be limited to peaceful activities. Yes, 100% in agreement. Now, how to ensure that? Well, it's a long-term objective. And a bit like in, I would not say nuclear weapon because this would certainly not be a good precedent, but a bit in some other domain, like take chemical weapons as a better example. It will be a progressive work to establish confidence first, make sure that states are bound by a number of rules, and then progressively disarm and achieve the result they want. But the problem is that we are not in a place where there's no weapons. We are obliged to think in terms of disarmament rather than non-proliferation. The NAM approach is purely, if I would say, non-proliferation, prevention, protection a priori, but this is not totally in line with current developments.
Yes, we have to learn from the experience we have in other policy fields like arms control and proliferation. And actually, we in the German Foreign Office, we are actually working on this, trying to define what we can transfer from these politics to cyber politics. But very frank, I realized one problem. If you're talking about with experts who are experts in arms control, they don't understand anything about cyber. If you talk with cyber experts, they don't understand anything about arms control or proliferation. So this is really difficult to have a helpful discussion with all these experts. And at the very end, I think we have to accept that governments don't own the internet or the cyberspace. And this makes it more complicated. I learned that you never should use analogies in cyberspace because they are not helpful, because this is really unique. But Sometimes I'm just thinking of one analogy, and I ask you, just think back just 500 years, the pirates of the Caribbean. I mean, sometimes it seems to me it's like at that time when the sea was important for exchange of views, for traveling, for commerce, and there were so many pirates and volunteers and no rules at all. But it took a long time, several hundred years, until we had a treaty when pirates were banned. And this is the other problem. I really believe in cyberspace we don't have enough time.
So just a couple of things. First of all, you know, there is a big difference, obviously, between space and cyberspace. Jim has heard me say this before, but people often talk about various global commons and saying that cyberspace is a global commons, which it clearly is not, because there is, you know, physical ownership. It does exist in different countries. There is certain aspects of sovereignty apply. And so the term I coined now a few years ago was it's more like a global condominium in a lot of ways, because you have this sort of joint ownership. But also when you talk about the threats we're facing in cyberspace, and this goes to this idea of trying to deal with cyber weapons, it's not really clear what a cyber weapon is as the technology moves very fast. For instance, there's dual-use technology where the same code can be used by penetration testers to enhance cybersecurity and can also be used for other purposes. And so it's hard to get a handle on that as this moves forward. And then some states, quite frankly, think of things like Facebook and Twitter as cyber weapons. So that's a whole different issue in terms of a whole different worldview, because they're worried about stability and they're worried about the free flow of information. So I do think there are huge differences in doing that. But I go back to this idea of the work we've been doing, particularly in these peacetime norms. Those are the kind of things that do build stability. So if you don't attack the critical infrastructure, if countries agree that absent wartime they're not going to do that, that leads to that greater stability, just like you would have in space. So I think there are some analogies you can draw there. The other thing I just want to very quickly address is this, and it's kind of part of the answer I already gave, is this idea that a lot of states, and you hear this from a lot of states, talk about sovereignty in cyberspace and how they're trying to control their information space or draw a border, a digital border around their territory, and that they have a right to control everything in there. And sovereignty does apply in cyberspace. However, there are limits, and the limits are where you have internationally recognized human rights. When you get to actually have the free flow of information across borders, and you cannot restrict that even though some states would want to. So there's a lot of further development here, but when people throw around some of these terms, they're not very precise, and they're actually not using them in ways that are applicable to international law. And the last final thing I'd say is in the GG report, the idea of not using proxies, I think, is also an important part of this greater stability.
Yeah, I was going to bring up sovereignty, if only because I know people wanted to talk about it, but also because when you speak to countries in the developing world or in the non-aligned movement or in the G77, this is often their opening point, particularly when it comes to the United States, because they see this role of sovereignty and the US challenge to sovereignty and things like the use of drones as crucial. And so the trend now in discussions of cybersecurity is the extension of sovereignty and trying to define the boundaries between sovereign and extraterritorial. On that note, one of the things you also hear from a lot of these countries is that we need new norms and we need new international laws, and that what we have now is inadequate. One example of that might be, and it's gotten better in its second version, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's Code of Conduct, which it's worth looking at version 2, where they apparently listened to some of the complaints and revised it. But let me ask the panelists, and then I hope we can get some from the floor. If not, I have loads. Where do you think we need new norms? Where do we need new international law? What do you say to people who say that existing international law, international norms are inadequate? They didn't think I was going to ask hard questions.
So, I mean, I think in part I've already answered this, that first you have to elucidate what the existing international law means in cyberspace. There are differences in cyberspace in terms of things like proportionality and distinction and other issues for that very high level. And then when we talk about these peacetime norms, in some ways these are new, right? These are ones that, again, we find have general applicability, and I think that's important. I'd also say that, look, this code of conduct as it evolves still is not very clear what it means. And if you read it, there are certain passages that are still core to the code of conduct that deal with non-interference. I mean, these are concepts from the 50s, frankly, non-interference with states, et cetera, that really goes to the heart of some of these issues that really are beyond international security, and they talk about international human rights and even internet governance to some aspects. So even if the language is prettier, there are still some core issues there that are quite problematic, including parts of UN documents that are partially quoted and you don't quote the whole thing. So I think we have to look at that with a great deal of skepticism. Interesting document, but a great deal of skepticism. So I do think we're making progress on this, but at the same time, it's not, you shouldn't have you don't need to create new, and we've said this before, new international legal instruments. You can apply the ones you have. And this siren song of saying, let's create a whole new thing because it's cyberspace, I think is a mistake and would lead to instability in the long term.
The less trust, the more talking about national sovereignty, I think. And from these countries, there is a lot about protecting their data, protecting their IT system, and so on. But I think the digital age just begins. We have in 2020 more or less 50 billion of things connected to the internet. And when you think about the internet as an ecosystem, so I think that's the answer to your question. You need, what you have to do is to protect this ecosystem like you have to protect the climate or whatsoever. And if we really want to have internet and cyberspace to bring in more health, to bring in more wealth, to bring labor into our communities, I think we have to protect the system. And this is not only about classical security policy, it is more. It is about security and trust in a broader thing.
Very much online with previous speaker, without surprise. At this stage, the European Union, that's the official position, does not support the Shanghai Code of Conduct, despite a number of merits it has. And why? Because we consider still that even the second version suggests that the internet should be governed by states, and this, at this stage, is not fully in line with our view about the need of maintaining the current multi-stakeholder model of internet governance. And it also seeks to legitimize some form of censorship of internet contents, and we fully agree that we cannot accept all contents on internet, but the way of doing it still needs to be reflected upon. So for the time being, we consider that we have enough food on our plate in making sure that existing law is implemented in cyberspace to protect the cyber ecosystem. I like this formula. And that we have also to work to improve and making more authentically multilateral the current internet governance organization, and that's why we continue discussing with the EU, within the EU and with the US how to make that happen. We know that there are some reluctances with the dominant role of the US to maintain a sincere and efficient multi-stakeholder model. We have to adapt that. The US have given some signs of and taken some measures in that sense. We have to continue in this field if we want to make this model viable in the middle and long term. And that said, I would also echo the relatively careful position expressed by Commissioner Riddle, because if it is, we believe it's therefore a bit premature to develop such instruments as a code of conduct. But on a personal note, I would say that would we be faced with some tragic developments in the field of cybersecurity, it would probably make that much less premature than it appears today.
Great. I hope we have time to come back to the question of the balance between human rights and agreement. Because one of the things I will say is when you talk to not just Russia and China, but to the non-aligned countries, and particularly the new powers, you do hear something a little different. And so something we might want to touch on eventually is there's a way to think about, is this an activity? We're talking about norms here, right? Is this something that the like-minded countries do? Is it something that the G20 does? Is it a global agreement? Is it regional? And there might be more success at a regional level. But I'm going to give them an easy one. There's another set of actors that I think all of our speakers have touched on, which is the private sector. So while you're thinking of your questions, so you can walk up to that microphone and ask them, I'm going to ask them, what should the role of the private sector be? Noting that many of our more powerful discussants in this field, like China, don't believe the private sector should have any role. But why don't we start with that one?
So first, just let me say that when I talk about trying to build a consensus around these norms, that is not just a consensus of the West and some other countries. That is very much meant to be a very big tent. We've had a lot of discussions, and we'll continue to have discussions with countries like India and Brazil and others, where I think, again, this is something that could serve their ultimate interest too. So it's not, and it shouldn't be limited to those countries. We need to do as much outreach as possible with other countries and listen to them as well. So I think that that's important. Second, on the private sector, I do think, look, the private sector, this is a unique space. The private sector owns most of the infrastructure. I've heard all kinds of numbers. I've never actually seen anything you can cite to that goes to this 85% number, but everyone agrees it's a large number. And so they do have a role. And not just the private sector, but civil society has a role in these issues. That's why I thought the Dutch conference was so good, because it brought together all these actors. That's why I think the Internet Governance Forum is so good, because it brings together this multi-stakeholder group. Now, when you're talking about international security, of course, governments, just like they have in the traditional space, are going to be the ones to discuss things at the GG, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be talking to the private sector writ large, and not just in this country, but around the world. I mean, I think one of the things that I found is that in some countries, the private sector has not been as involved in the debates about all of these issues. The civil society hasn't been as much, so we need to bring that forward. And some of the policy dialogues we do with other countries, we actually have a day where we bring the other stakeholders in. So I do think they certainly have a role, and a number of the private sector companies are really active in this issue. And it shouldn't just be American companies, it should be really companies around the world, because they do have a stake. Now, they're going to have their perspective, and that's a valuable perspective, and states are going to be thinking about international security from their perspective, but I think it's important to have them involved.
And I'm going to interject something here to hopefully shape some of the following comments. But so I've started asking officials from other countries, when we say multi-stakeholder, what do you hear? And the most frequent answer I get back is hegemony, continued hegemony. So think about the reaction of the NAM countries, of the newly emerging powers. What is it you'd say to them on this issue?
So just one comment on that. This is why I think it has to be more inclusive. All of our multi-stakeholder models for governance have really led to the growth of the internet we have today. But I think we all agree they need to be more inclusive of stakeholders from around the world in all of these different areas. And I think that's an important part of it. I also think that that you hear this idea of hegemony, and I think that just belies the fact that more stakeholders haven't gotten involved. And I've talked to countries, and I say, look, you have a great opportunity here, including very populous countries, to be even more involved in these institutions, to step up and play even a greater role. And that goes for not just you, but your other stakeholders as well.
Norbert.
Very, very short. When I took over as Commissioner for International Cyber Policy, my first international conference was the Internet Government Forum, Internet Governance Forum, multi-stakeholder conference with several thousand people. This was a hell of an experience, I can tell you. But I'm a real and strong believer of multi-stakeholder principle. And when I'm talking to people from private companies, I am always urging them to have a bigger role in the governance discussion. Because, as I said, the internet is an ecosystem, And I really believe that all the users, science, the companies, private companies, as well as governments, have to come together to use this and to work on this. So I can just urge private companies, engage yourself.
And you know, the reality is that this ecosystem is very heterogeneous when it comes to public sector. And so I think there's not a single model of dealing with private sector.
Let's start with the question. And please introduce yourself.
Sean Lingus with Federal Computer Week magazine. There's a question for Ambassadors Riedel and Rivasso. Can you, in the public statements the U.S. government made blaming Sony for the North Korea hack, they mentioned that international partners agreed with the attribution to a certain degree, several of them anyway. Can you describe how your respective governments went about assessing the evidence, if you did? And more broadly, can you talk about the need in such cases for you to, how verifying the attribution helps with international norms, and would you ask the same of the U.S. administration, for example, for the hack on the French television station?
I'm surprised because I thought this is a question for Chris.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Smiling.
He's taking a pass.
No, I just can tell you, I mean, believe it or believe it not, what they say about the attribution. I mean, this is a real problem, and Chris is always, if you allow, he is telling me, for example, follow the money, or there's a political explanation for a lot of things which are happening. I think this is really difficult, and we are very cautious. If attacks like that are happening, our fear is that this can lead to escalation. So, as I said, we are very cautious, and maybe that's it. Chris, help me.
So, I mean, I think as we said, attribution is difficult in this space, but it's not impossible. And you do look at various different things, including the digital trail, but not exclusively the digital trail to make attribution. Also, you're not going to publicly come out and say what the attribution is in every case, even if you know. Attribution does, I think, lead a level of complexity here, because particularly for single events, it's harder to attribute if the people who are doing it have done their homework and their tradecraft well. For longer term events, it's easier, just like it would be in the physical world. So this is something I think we need to continue to develop and make sure that we're doing it. But when we have things like our sanctions policy that came out recently, we will be sure before we apply sanctions, or really anything else, or as sure as we can be in terms of attribution. And it also, the other thing that I think is a good example is when you have cases like Sony and others, where other people's territory is used to launch an attack, that makes them part of the game, and they want to then cooperate because they don't want the perception that they are launching it. And so I think that's another way we could build better cooperation.
And I would add, Francois, are you going to say something?
Yeah, very briefly, great note of caution. The first axis of efforts for us in working on this issue is to enhance transparency. That's why you heard the word transparency everywhere in what the three of us have said. There are cases where you can have and make an attribution in full security. There are not so many. And we are also very cautious in if we go that road down, to make sure also that this doesn't lead to escalation, as this would be contrary to our principles.
It's useful to note that I think we need to start thinking about what the world will look like when attribution is less of a problem, and that's the path we're on. We also want to recognize that different countries have different abilities to attribute, and that creates a tension in the discussion of norms. Can we get the next question, please? Thank you.
Hi, Dave Weitzel, wearing my hat, is American Bar Association Privacy and Computer Crime Co-Chair. I was invited because of work we've done with ITU-D to be at a conference in Africa several years ago. And as we were talking about cybercrime, it's very easy for us to get dystopian. It's very easy to talk about the bad. But we must always remember here that email connects families, around the world. People visit websites to connect to cultures and communities.
Was there a question?
The question is, with the norms we're worried about, how do we make sure that those high-valued norms with this new technology, the internet, stays there as we build the things to protect it?
Absolutely a good point, because I think when we came out with the international strategy for cyberspace in 2011, it wasn't couched as a cybersecurity strategy, and indeed it wasn't. It was a strategy for international cyberspace generally. It talked about the good, the important economic and social good the internet has led to. One of the things I spend a lot of time doing in my office is capacity building, for instance, in Africa. We've done regional ones in East Africa, South Africa, West Africa. And one of the first ones we did was in Nairobi, where they had M-Pesa, a payment system that was revolutionary and better than, frankly, we had in the US. So obviously the whole goal of this, security is not an end in itself. It is a way to support that platform, to keep it as inclusive, to keep the multi-stakeholder system, to keep the open internet that really helps trade and social policy around the world, and that's the goal. So security always has to serve that.
Naturally, as we get to the end of the program, we've got a long line of questioners coming up. So let's keep both our questions and perhaps our answers as short as possible.
I'll just say yes or no.
Well, and since this is diplomacy, I think you should also add maybe.
Thank you.
So I'm Kim Zetter with Wired. I had a question regarding something that a couple of you touched on regarding norms of behavior and putting critical infrastructure off the table, and also using proxies for attack. I'm wondering in your discussions if this has come up, or if you have comments on this. The Stuxnet worm that was used to attack Iran used 2 stolen digital certificates that were stolen from a company in Taiwan. The Flame espionage tool had undermined the Microsoft Windows Update system in order to impersonate a legitimate Microsoft program. It also used a hash from a legitimate Microsoft certificate. So I'm wondering, what about critical infrastructure of the internet and using third-party companies and their reputations in attacks?
Norbert, can we start with you on that one? Is that okay? Is that?
Don't know.
No, okay. Then Francois?
No, I should look a bit more in that specific case. I have no answer either.
Maybe we'll just hold up things with numbers on them. But, Chris, last chance. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think obviously the whole goal of looking at these norms, and even at the high conflict in the other areas, to make the whole ecosystem more stable and secure. And so there's a lot of work to be done there, but that's exactly the path we're following.
Next question, please.
Yes, Ryuichi Hirano from NISC Japan. I would like to ask your views on the outcome of the Hague conference on this issue. I mean, well, I was paying attention to discussions in 2 different fora simultaneously held 2 weeks ago. I mean, well, at UNGGE, the discussion is still going on the issue of application of international law. On the other hand, in The Hague, rather ambitious statement, chairman's statement, was adopted. It clearly stated the applicability of existing international law, and also it mentioned the possibility of exploring non-binding norms, and also it even mentioned legitimate response measures to cyber attacks. So I thought it went ahead of the discussion of the UNGGE. So yeah, I would like to know your views.
So I participated in the discussion with the Foreign Minister of Australia and others at the conference, and I think the statement, the fact it says that international applies, that's drawn from the GG. That's not new ground. I think that's simply saying that their sense is even a greater group of stakeholders would endorse that, and I think that's important. I don't think it all stole the thunder from the GG. I think it was a complementary process to discuss some of these issues, and I think what it embodied in that statement is really what we've already seen out of the GG and looking forward.
I think the conference was a big success until just the moment I learned about the passing away of Roger, whom I met in Den Haag. But I really thought this was a very good conference, and for two reasons. It raised awareness on the political level about cybersecurity, and this is very, very important because not everywhere there is enough awareness. And the second, I think, capacity building. We launched the forum regarding capacity building, and this is a very good signal.
Same answer.
Yeah, I would say that many people, including Roger, encouraged the Dutch, who had a very extensive preparatory process, to think of things they could do to support the work of the GGE. So in that sense, I think the chairman's statement was very helpful. Next question.
In the Internet Governance Forum, I myself have been part of that more as a technologist. I also want to raise...
Introduction.
Oh, I'm sorry, Medicate KO, Double Shot Security Independent.
Thank you.
I also want to raise the awareness that Facebook is right now being used to help Nepal. And so I gave a security workshop in 2004 in Nepal and a lot of the South Asian regions. And so I'm very happy to hear that also on a political level, right? I mean, what really needs to be done is a global overall look at the multi-stakeholder issues, because sometimes security doesn't quite lead to openness. And so as I look at the telecommunications companies that have opened up communications to help the people in Nepal so that everybody has the awareness, that's I mean, extremely critical. And my question is, within your own countries and, you know, in your roles, what kind of work are you doing to also ensure the human rights, the criticality of openness of communication, while also restricting from a security perspective?
So this goes back to the prior question in a way. This is core to what when we talk about cyberspace, we just don't talk about security in isolation. We talk about all these pillars, including governance issues and human rights issues. And indeed, if you look at our international strategy, it's a core part of that. And I work in my own building, the State Department, very closely with our democracy and human rights folks. And indeed, I'm going to Mongolia next week for the Coalition on Freedom Online, which is a core thing that both of us are members of, both Germany and the US, and we're trying to expand that. So you're absolutely right. I mean, the goal, again, is to make sure that we have the open internet, improve, get more people involved, but have the open internet that's led to all the success we've had, and do security in a way that makes sense. So not use security as a proxy to restrict the openness.
Exactly. That's also why I'm going to Ulaanbaatar next Saturday. And I think this is also from us a very important signal that we want to help these countries who are asking for help. We have an exchange on views. We try to convince them what we think is the right way to have an internet governance which guarantees an open, free and secure and so on internet. And I think this is a very important and very good way.
Yeah, indeed the EU has recognized that as a key priority, and particularly in Asia, we have supported this workshop and workshop in Malaysia also in 2014, and we are working closely with Netherlands. As you know, in our strategy, and you will see that probably when the new paper Food for Thought is made public, you will see that there is an important component about the need to build resilient information infrastructures in third countries, and particularly in developing countries like the one you alluded to.
We've had a proposal that I let both of you ask questions, and then they will choose which one they answer. In a way, it's kind of appealing. Just as a quick footnote, one of the problems we have is that if you're truly multi-stakeholder on a global basis, it will be a different set of characters than we have now. And I think displacing the current multi-stakeholders is one of the tensions in the discussion of this. But why don't we have both questions really quick, and then we're going to finish.
Joe Marks from Politico. Ambassador Rydell, I noted that you mentioned the Proliferation Security Initiative as a model for cooperation in cyberspace, as Ambassador Painter has here and many other times before. I'm wondering, first, if that means we have at least 2 charter members for this group, and then second, how you go about taking it from theory to reality.
Okay. No, wait. Go ahead. Yeah.
Chris Castelli with Inside Cybersecurity. Admiral Rogers has talked about potential adversaries leaving cyber fingerprints on U.S. critical infrastructure to send a message that our homeland is at risk if tensions ever escalate. To what extent can norms address that problem, which is more insidious than literal cyber attacks?
So I choose to answer the first question. Actually, the idea about the PSI, it was Joe Nye who came up with the idea, and we discussed it. I'm quite neutral. I asked other colleagues from other governments what they think about that. And the reaction was, let's say, different and difficult. And what I would like to do is to have, let's start with a conference of think tanks from several countries. And for example, I'm thinking about US, Germany, India, bring them together and think about that idea. At the moment, I think it doesn't make sense to bring in governments already, and because then you have some governments who are in and others who are out. So let's start it from a more academic view. I think this would be a good opportunity. I'm convinced about that.
So again, you know, I know, Joe, you've said this before. It's not we're using the Proliferation Security Initiative as and following it slavishly. The idea is it's a loose analogy. You don't take it very far, but the idea behind it, the core thing, which I think Norbert and I do agree on, and many other governments I've talked to have agreed on, is that the way you build a consensus is do exactly that. You come up with some norms and discuss them and build a consensus over time. And the aspect of the PSI in the long term is that in the long term, that when you get a greater group of countries who all endorse these norms, that then they can act against those who transgress them. That's long in the future. This is a long process, not as long as the nuclear world, but it's a long process. And my deputy, Michelle Markoff, I think, was the one who first proposed this idea, this analogy, many years ago now. And I think it's something that bears, again, as an analogy, not as a firm model, as an analogy to how we can build a consensus over time.
Last remark.
To please, James, each time we speak about non-proliferation, we know that we have to think also in terms of cooperation. So I think there should be also a reflection about the part which would be how to better cooperate with those who are less developed than others to make sure that, in that case, a bit like in the nuclear field, they can enjoy the benefits.
Well, join me in thanking the panel, please.